Well, welcome, Troy Fields. I've been looking forward to this interview with you for quite some time. I know Caroline has as well. Okay, so Troy, we want to know all about you. Tell me, were you an artist before you were diagnosed with ALS, or is this a newfound skill for you?
Um, I'm, a, I'm an artist wannabe. I always fancy myself as having some artistic talent, and to realize that I feel way short of at least my view or sort of standard for you know artists in general, um, which I guess made me respect artists and their talent a lot more when you realize that you would want to have that level of talent and yet not not quite there. So, um, but I've always enjoyed it, the attempt, at creating something that was different, or from a blank piece of paper in whichever way that was, either music or painting or photography or writing, whatever it was, just filling that page with something different that is sort of your view, um, you know, and then let other folks decide if they think it's art or not. At least the process is enjoyable.
Mm. I think I can definitely relate to that feeling of my art is not good enough to really be called art, and I think that's why I call myself an art aficionado as opposed to an artist.
Yep, that
You know,
that feeling.
I've always been a creative and I can always envision something and this is how it should look, whether it be, a costume or a piece of art. And I could never quite get that piece to look like what I thought it should look like. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I gave up on a lot of my creative endeavors.
That's exactly it. I mean, I get a lot of my creative ideas at night when I'm half asleep. Your eyes are closed, you're rested, but
Call
your
them my
mind is
3 a.m. ideas.
uh,
I get the best
exactly.
ideas at 3 a.m.
And I can picture it. I mean, I
Yeah.
had, great plans. I can see it. And it's like, well, that shouldn't be that hard to do. But it is that hard to, it's that hard to create what you pictured in your
Mhm.
head and um, making it real, tangible, um, you know, and then you get frustrated and put it aside and said, no. I, I found in my kids' school projects were actually about as close as I came to actually feeling like creating something. And yes, I know the kids are supposed to do their own projects, but I think we all know that more often than not is the parents' project, um, and then the kids just take it from the car to the classroom. I mean, they're
Mhm.
there, they help, but I can remember uh, my youngest daughter had a project she had to do, um, something from space, and we did the Mars rover. And that was one thing I could point to say, yeah, you see, I'm an artist. Look at this masterpiece we created.
Not
Um,
just an artist, but also an engineer, huh?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, you know, uh, you know, those types of things, that sort of let the creative juices sort of flow. And uh, so I've had my moments, but they've been few. Fewer
Remind
than
us
what
how
I,
long.
fewer than what I would have liked to, let's say.
Yeah. I think I feel the same way. Remind us how long you've been living with ALS, Troy.
So I always have two dates in mind.
Mhm.
I was told that phrase, I'm fairly certain that what you have is ALS. And that was January 10th, 2018. My confirmation of a diagnosis is 7 years this month. In fact, earlier this week, it's 7 years.
Mhm. That's a long time.
Yep, I'm lucky.
Yeah, it's great. We're lucky to have you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we are.
So you and I have
Skip.
done an interview about your artwork before, and you've
Yes.
submitted some similar stuff to what you submitted 2 years ago. I wish you had submitted for our last one too. We'd like to have you every year, but we'll just have to do that moving forward.
Yeah.
Um, but tell me about a little bit about how your artistry has changed as your diagnosis or your disease has progressed.
Yeah. So I've I've dabbled in a lot of different things. Um, 30 years ago, maybe longer, um, I decided music was my thing. So I just have a passion for music.
Mhm.
And my brother played guitar, and he took me bought an acoustic guitar, and he taught me the basic chords and so on. And I had enough that I could entertain at a little gathering of friends. I grabbed the guitar and just play things everybody can sing along. I never progressed past you know the chords, and but that's good enough for those occasions. Um, and I thought, well, I can write music. No, I can't. So um, I wrote little songs for the kids as they were growing up about our dogs and stuff, um, that were hits only in my house. But to this day, the kids remember them, so that was cool.
Oh.
Um, and then photography became the thing. I bought myself a camera, and you know, over time invested in different lenses and stuff. And I found photography was, or could be, much more forgiving. I would have
Mm.
rather paint, to be honest with you. I think in another life, maybe I was a painter. Um, but as we mentioned before, transforming whatever you envision in your head to a canvas uh, is difficult. Um, but I still tried. My wife and I would go to these, you know, things where you have a few drinks and you paint, and somebody's there to help you and make date nights out of it and things like that. And we had a lot of fun, but nothing we would hang in the walls in our house. But it was a lot of fun doing it. But it served to give it a try, but then also at the end realize I'm not a painter. Um, so but found photography to be more forgiving, and especially with digital photography, because I never liked the idea of take a bad picture and then crop it and adjust it later. Now the idea is take the photo right the first time, you know,
Mm.
don't edit it after. Um,
Mm.
because I think that's the real trick, you know. Um, and and so I always aim for that, and obviously nothing against editing the pictures after and stuff, but for me the creative part really came at the start of the picture, right? Capturing it from the get-go, setting the right apertures and stuff to let the light come in a certain way. But at the moment, not after.
Mm.
And I traveled an awful lot in my career. Um, Often more than half of my time I spent abroad, and that was my thing was I'd take my camera, especially if I had to stay the weekend wherever I was, and walk around and just I had nothing better to do, so take pictures. You know, walk around the street and you can find the way a certain window comes out and the sun, just stuff like that. And I really enjoyed it. Um, but of course, then ALS happened, and I can remember probably March 2019. My wife and I took a trip. My brother was living in New York at the time, and so we took a car and drove from New York City to Newport, Rhode Island.
Mm.
Spent a few days out there, and it's just a nice little drive around, the coast. And I found I couldn't quite hold the camera anymore, or didn't have the strength to hit the shutter. And I was like, not that too. I can't
Oh,
play guitar anymore. I can't, it's like, so that was kind of like that last bit. And um, so I had to figure out some other way of still be creative. Um, and the idea of, okay, what if I take pictures I've already taken and now create something from that? And so I flipped the script.
mm.
I did my attempt at capturing the best picture I could at the start.
Mhm.
And now I'm like, so now let's apply filters, but not to crop it, but like to just something very different, something that, you know, might look like a painting or might look like something different. And I could still move my fingers enough. And if I position my phone a certain way, with the photo editing, sorry for the dog in the background.
Oh, it's
Uh,
fine.
um,
Yeah.
He's
but
now been immemorialized, or,
yes,
memorialized, I guess I should say.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but if I can hold my phone a certain way, and I could then move my finger on the screen to apply filters, in different ways, not the whole picture, but in parts of the picture, highlight certain things or change it up in certain ways. And it was not just one filter. What happens if you put layer filter upon filter upon filter and really start to play with things and you know and that's pretty much kind of where I ended up, um, and it's been fun.
Now is probably a good time to go ahead and share your artwork so that people can see what we're talking about.
It's like the ultimate workaround ALS. I love it. I love it. Like, take that, ALS. You can't stop me.
Well, I think the A in ALS stands for adapt,
Yes.
um, because from early go they tell you about adaptive clothing and
Mm.
adaptive utensils and adaptive this and adaptive that, and so I think eventually it sort of becomes like embedded in your in the way you think. So
Mm-hmm.
everything you look at is there's got to be some other way to
Mhm.
get around it
Mm-hmm.
and get to where you want to what you want to do,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
100% resilience is
Great, exactly.
something that if you weren't good at it before, you definitely learn it on this journey.
Yep.
You know,
Mhm.
yeah. So, for
So,
example, go ahead.
I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to tell you about this particular
Mm-hmm.
item. I don't know if that's what
Let's
you were
take a
going to.
look. Let's look at this picture here. Yeah.
So, um, there are two that are related. Um, this is the Colosseum in Rome, and in 2017, I was already starting to have symptoms. And long story, but I'll just keep it to the relevant parts. My son uh, wanted to go on one of those school trips that are supposed to be these educational trips to different places, and we ended up. It was the end of his senior year, and I'd done this with all the kids. Right, tell them to pick one place that they wanted to go. I had plenty of miles in airline and stuff, and so it was like, just once they graduated from high school, take a trip with that one child, just kind of, um, so they have that kind of special moment. And so he wanted to go on this school trip. It happened to be Italy. I had already been to Italy before, but he hadn't. And so it's like, fine, let's do Italy. And we did this 10-day trip. And so I'd taken these pictures of that, uh, from that trip. Then 2 years later, he was moving to an apartment, and he bought an orange couch. That is not
Because
my
why not?
apartment.
Because you
It's
can.
not. He's young. He'll learn. Um, but that's okay. That's that was. And so he said something about um, uh, doing that he needed some artwork or something for his apartment. And I had a guitar pick that was a Rolling Stones guitar pick, and I had done something similar as this in that guitar pick. And he had orange, and I said, what if I take pictures from our trip and do something similar with orange so that it matches couch, and he could put it in the wall, and it would be meaningful because it was our trip together. And so this is one of the ones that I created, and it's the Colosseum. A lot of orange because of his couch, um, and it was just different layers, just first sort of try to get some of the detail of the Colosseum, and then layer colors and just different effects on it, um, so that you could still recognize that it's or could guess at least at kind of what it was, but still create something totally different. Um, and so that's this one, and there's a similar one of the Trevi Fountain that is in as part of that same collection. It just um, again heavy on the orange so that it would match his couch. Um, um, the irony of it all is he decided not to hang these two paintings, or not paintings, but pictures in his wall, and instead he took my Rolling Stone pick. Uh, that was the inspiration. And it's like, that was my pick. These two were pictures of our trip, the father-son trip. wouldn't that be more meaningful to you? And he's like, yeah, I like them, but
They're not
I
as
have,
cool as the Rolling Stone pic.
that's exactly it. That's, and to this day, we had dinner with him a couple of nights ago. Um, and sure enough, there's the Rolling Stone pic is still hanging in his wall. So, you know, um,
Well, going back to this one, I can tell even before you did the work, which I think is amazing, the layers and the color, and they're very vibrant and it's beautiful. Just looking at the perspective that you got, just looking at the perspective that you got on this picture is pretty amazing. Um, your photography chops were pretty substantial in the first place.
um, yeah, I mean, it's something I enjoy. Just how can I capture it in a different angle, or you know,
Most
um,
people step way back and they want to get the entire building, but you don't get the sense of scale from it that you do in this picture where you're literally standing at the base and you're looking up. So I can just imagine how massive it might have seemed to you just standing there.
I and I'm sure there's got to be some psychological thing from my childhood uh, to explain this, but something about the repetition. I have a lot of pictures that I took that were of the repetition of arches or the repetition of columns. I also remember walking around Mexico City and they had um, the electric bikes and they were all lined up and the repetition of the bikes. And I think, you know, the repetition of the columns, um, of I'm sorry, not the columns, the arches, um, was something that I wanted to focus on. Um, but it's so massive that, you don't fit all the arches,
Mhm.
but, that kind of, it draws, my eye and my lens. It's, um, but you're right, the sort of looking up just to kind of get a sense of just, how big and massive, it is.
But
Um,
also the fact that in the upper elevation, you included the broken part, where it breaks away, where it's not complete. It would be a completely different picture had you been moved over 5 feet and not had that spot. You might not have actually recognized this as the Colosseum were it not missing that piece. So just the way you framed it, instantly I'm going to know that this is the Colosseum.
it's yeah, it denotes, you know, all the time that has passed. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
that is is an ancient, building. It's um, you know, but yet there it stands, right?
And the same with the fountain. You have moved into a perspective, as you're standing there, your eye has all this peripheral vision and you can see the entire building, but also see all the detail right in front of you. And if somebody tries to step back and take a picture of the entire building or the entire fountain, you don't necessarily get to see the detail. Only by zooming in, and the perspective isn't squared off, it's not perfect, it's you're standing there in front of this building, and it's much more realistic to me, the perspective that you got in this picture.
Um, yeah, I mean, if you've ever seen the Trevi Fountain, it's significantly wider than
Mm-hmm.
just this one element. Um, and I always thought that it was neat how, they have um, the main central figure, which I believe is Poseidon, and then you have the flow that kind of comes out, and you don't necessarily know that it's a fountain per se, but seeing sort of those waves kind of coming down still emits the sense of water, of without seeing the water, if that makes sense.
It
Um,
does.
Mhm. Yep.
like emerging from the waves. Um, and so it becomes less about a fountain and more about this character that sort of emerges right from the water. And I always thought that was kind of cool.
Absolutely. And you've got the architectural element, but then also the sculptural elements of this fountain as well. And they're all captured in perfect form in this picture. So I love it. And I even love the colors. There's not, I don't, if I had to tell you what my least favorite color was, I would probably guess orange because it just can seem so jarring to me. But when you mix it in with all these other colors, it's so complementary and just seems so tropical to me and vibrant in this way.
Well, and the combination of blue and orange, and if Tim Lowry ever sees this, he's gonna block me on Facebook. But I went to University of South Florida. Our colors are green and gold. My
Okay,
brother
well, I
went
hadn't
to
equated that, but
my brother went to University of Florida, whose colors
yeah.
are blue and orange.
Mhm.
And so picking blue and orange in my household, is a cardinal sin. Um, so it was painful to pick those colors. But the couch was orange.
So you had no
it was
choice.
it was all about matching the couch.
Yes.
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 I still love it. I love that story too.
Troy,
All right.
wait, I would just want to ask, how many children do you have?
There's 4 altogether.
Four.
It's a his, hers, and ours
Okay.
situation. So there's 4.
So for this one, I kind of want to flip back over to Canva and show all 3 of them together. Here is where I took those images and I positioned them in the order of the colors of the French flag.
Yep. Then that's how they were intended, was to.
Well, that's good. I picked up what you were putting down there.
Yeah.
So this is how they're going to be represented in the gallery. All right. Stop sharing. I'm going to go back to the other. All right. So tell me about the Eiffel Tower pic.
Well, it's easy to recognize that is the Eiffel Tower. If memory serves right, I did these after I did the ones for my son, and sort of borrowed on the idea, but decided to play with it a little bit and do, something that was just slightly different. And the idea of this is France. Let's use the colors of the French flag. And my original thought was to put these like in a T-shirt and just have, a T-shirt that would have icons of Paris, in the colors of the French flag. And so, starting with the blue and the Eiffel Tower, and of course, you're talking about perspective. It could have been the entire Eiffel Tower, but I kind of like the sort of the way that it just, you get a sense of the elevation by just kind of focusing on that, on the rise of the tower, if you will, how it just sort of, um, it's elongated, if you will, and in the picture. And by making the picture skinny like that, I think it emphasizes it even more. Like you're drawn to, this very tall structure. And then with some of the filters coming in, you can still pick up the elements of, the various pieces, but they're still sort of, like scrambled a bit, which I liked. And I think in the Eiffel Tower in particular, because of the way that the metal is all sort of intertwined as you look at the Eiffel Tower, it's almost exaggerating that a little bit. Uh, to me, I thought it was kind of cool, big sort of way of really accentuating how, all of the very elaborate metal work really comes together.
That and the fact that it is off to the side, it's not centered in the picture, just also illustrates movement and that upward, view and that upward gaze that you would have as you're lifting your head up to look at it. If it were just centered on the page, it would be like, yeah, that's the Eiffel Tower. I'm looking at it. And you don't get that sense of movement that you do the way that you have it framed here.
Yeah, well, that technique of you don't center the picture, you put it a little bit off to the side. This the rule of a third, I think, is how they usually refer to it, where you put the focus in sort of 1/3 of the picture, to give a different perspective. But so
It's
some,
effective.
yeah.
Okay.
And this is, of course, the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and it's the same idea. And I think usually, for these, I start by breaking down the picture into the black lines, right? The almost caricature or exaggerated caricature of whatever the picture was, and then play with the colors after. Um, but similar thing. It's not the whole structure, but you see the art, and again, I think you could identify it to know that most likely that's what it is, without having to see the whole thing. Um, uh, but similar idea
The
of
difference between this one, though, and this one is you have one color value. And on the one with the Eiffel Tower, there's two or multiple, the colors themselves are
yeah.
blended and washed in. And this is just like a wash of one color over the entire image. I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. And um, I haven't looked at these pictures in a while till I dug them up to send, for the gallery. But you're right. I don't know that that was something purposeful as much as it just, I worked on each one individually and so how they turned out. And this is slightly different than the others because the lines almost look like they are melting. Almost sounds more like Barcelona and a Gaudi structure than the um, Gothic architecture of Notre Dame, but you can still identify it as Notre Dame. Um, the circular, the stained glass in the two spires pretty much gives it away. But because it's white, the whitest of the French flag, um, you don't have the color to really hide the the lines. You don't have another filter on top, so the lines really stand out quite significantly, in this picture, and but still not straight, still sort of you know like it almost as if you want to touch it to feel the texture, that kind of feel.
I would agree. I'm going to move us back over and share all three one more time just so we can get one more view of them. And so when you put all three of them together, this is what you get. And I think that the effect was just perfect. And you're right, it would look great on a t-shirt. I'd
You know,
buy that t-shirt.
I never made the t-shirt, but I had designed, and at some point, I actually had some lettering going across something about, Je t'aime Paris or something along those lines.
Like in cursive or something.
Yeah, exactly. It was
Yeah.
it was in cursive because of the idea of making it into a t-shirt. I was privileged to, go to Paris twice, and of course, the center of Paris is just like walking in a time capsule. It's just amazing.
I would bet that there's a site that you could probably submit this artwork and have them create a t-shirt for you just like that.
Oh yeah. Well, that's sort of my side gig now. I come up with ideas and made my little, t-shirt store, which is not, and I could make it public, but I tend not to. But it's just, you ask at the beginning how, the evolution of my art or creativity over time. Well, it's now moved into, if I was to create a t-shirt, do something. And so, but yeah,
You might have to sneak that link over to me because I'm a little bit of a t-shirt aficionado. I like to collect t-shirts and silicone bracelets. I have a nice little collection going, so
I'll do that.
thank you. So is this something that you would say that you're passionate about now?
Um, Not really. The reason I
Just
say that is, it's a hobby, and it's, every once in a while I'll have an idea and put something out there. Um, I'm originally from Puerto Rico. My daughter and I are going to be going to San Juan in August. We're going to a Bad Bunny concert during his residence
nice.
in San Juan.
Very
Um,
nice.
and so I made some T-shirts for us, for the trip.
Mhm.
So it's a hobby. My passion, we're sort of redirected that creativity and energy and passion has really then been on the advocacy front.
Mhm.
And so if you ask me, what am I passionate about now, uh, it would be, my advocacy.
Absolutely.
That's really gets me going, in the morning when I wake up. Is, what am I doing about it today?
24/7. How can I fit in this thing for ALS? How can I fit in that thing for ALS? I've got a lunch break. I can schedule an interview during that lunch break, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
And the
These
thing about
these
it
don't
is,
ever come off. They're
yeah,
on I took them off for a doctor's procedure. Otherwise, they're on 24/7. And it's the first thing I think of when I wake up, and I think of it all day long and think of the specific people that each bracelet represents. And like you, can't wait.
and the thing is, with advocacy is there's an awful lot of behind the scenes work that has to happen so
Mhm,
that the front facing part can really be effective. And
mhm,
it's a lot,
mhm.
and it's usually unseen, and that's totally fine, but it's necessary stuff, so there's a lot of planning and strategizing, coordinating, that happens. Um, you know, it's like a chess game, and you know, you there's a lot of moves that you have to make in order to position yourself so that you can go for the checkmate. You don't do it out of one move. And so yeah, that's, I have a skill, I guess, for it. And so, and I guess you could say, well, that's not very creative. But the
No,
reality is, it is actually,
it
you
is
really
very
have to.
creative. Being able to plan something out from step one to step two to step three and having the patience to carry it out.
Yeah, you know, it's the long game.
Mhm.
The if you're an NBA fan, the 76ers for several years was their thing was trust the process, and applying that mantra of trust the process. Um, you know, make every move count to set you up for the next one. That kind of stuff. Um, However, because of this series of the artistry of ALS, I'm intrigued to learn more about painting with the eye gaze.
Mhm.
Um, and so maybe that's something I like to pick up
So why don't you, rather
along
than
the way.
starting with eye gaze, why don't you invest in a head mouse and maybe a bite switch and try
Okay.
that first? Um, Simply because of Brandy's experience, she was able to get very intricate, details in with just her head mouse and her bite switch. But then when she had to move over to eye gaze, it's much more generalized than using the head mouse and the bite switch.
That's good advice. I'll look into that.
And then she did work on she didn't have to get a special program. She just used the iPad and the notes program. She started out with a dark background and then she just started layering in color on top of that dark background.
As you know, I tried painting, used holding the brush in my mouth, and I got through one painting, which, you know, kind of a 10-year-old probably could have painted it, but, you know, I was using my mouth and, and a brush in my defense. Um, but my neck is too weak now to hold it and maneuver it the way I would have liked to. I would have liked to try that for longer, but
And depending on the sensitivity you have on that head mouse, like you could make minuscule movements.
okay.
And just like you can with a mouse, you can set it so that, just one little movement and it's all the way across the page.
Okay.
You can set the sensitivity of the head mouse as well. And it's like a pair of glasses that you put on over your glasses. So it's got the sensor in it. And as you're moving your head, that's what's helping you move. And I think that would be a good place for you to start.
Yep. I'll try that.
Okay.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Caroline, I'm going to break and see if you have any questions that you want to ask.
I don't. I apologize. I've been on mute because they're trimming the shrubs here. So no, I don't have any. I'm glad
Then
you're show, Troy.
Yeah, I was happy to do it. I always hesitate because of that thing of like, I've seen what some other folks submit and it's just, really fantastic. But it's also then gets intimidating because, you go, well, they're doing some cool stuff. And, I don't know if what I have rises to
I
that level, but
I think
just
it does. And it's yours. You're an individual. They're an individual. And it's individual art. It's art. It's paint on stones. We have one woman who does that. It's photography. One man with living with ALS, took a picture out of his living room window during all different seasons, and you see that. I mean, so it's also individual. It's all wonderful as far as I'm concerned.
I also just finished reading this book. I think it's called All the Beauty in the World. Let me just look it up. All the Beauty in the World by Patrick Bringley. And he was a man whose brother died of cancer, and he had kind of a, I don't want to say a breakdown, but a change of heart about what he was doing in the world. And he decided to go work at the Met as a security guard and worked there for many, 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 many years. And in the course of working there, got to really absorb all of the pieces of art. And it led him to be more curious about the artists themselves. And Michelangelo, who we know painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and was an amazing sculptor and amazing, you know, did not consider himself a painter, did not
Um,
consider himself an artist.
yeah,
So I think we're this just goes to show we're our own worst critics, and maybe we don't know so much
yeah.
about what art is if we're criticizing ourselves that way.
Yeah, I mean, I applaud all the people who have submitted something, because at the end of the day, probably there's nothing more vulnerable than taking that sort of piece of you, of
Mhm,
your individuality, and
mhm.
put it out there and display. If there's an act of courage, um, you know, it's hard to think of something more courageous than that. And
I
so
couldn't agree more.
to me, I just applaud all the people that, take that leap of faith and say, I'm going to put it out there. Um, and, so, it's nice to be sort of, in that company of folks who have, done that.
So that's a great segue into my next question for you, which is what is one thing you want people to know about you as they view your artwork?
I think that, almost like every human, that we're complex, that we're not single faceted. And most people know me for my advocacy, and that's great. I, uh, if they see that as something positive, and that's what they want to gravitate to, that's fantastic. But that's not all there is. Um, you know, ALS tends to, or tries to, shrink us down to something as simple as you're just a person living with ALS, and we become this, defined in this box. But yet, we're not. Um, we're still complex, multifaceted creatures with a capacity to think, a capacity to create. Um, and that continues to be me. I still have that capacity, beyond just advocacy and what people might otherwise know about me.
Mhm. It's very profound. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So that's one thing you've learned on this ALS journey. You think that's one of the most important things that you've learned, or you think there might be something that's a little more important, or something else that you want to share with people?
I I've learned a lot in my ALS journey, but I would sum it up that, um, I've surprised myself with what I've been able to do. So I think I've learned a lot more about myself through this journey than say what I've learned about, like external to me. Um, you know, I I've learned about my own resilience. I've learned about my own capacity to adapt. I've learned about my own ability to overcome, um, to not get hung up on what I can't do and sort of focus on what I can. Had you asked me before my diagnosis, I don't know that I would have been so sure. But you know, I prove it to myself every day. So I think that's what I've learned the most. It's just my own capability um, to endure and move on.
Isn't that what's most beautiful about human beings in general is their ability to adapt to their situations and create despite the hardships, create something amazing. And that's something that you do both through your advocacy and your artistry and your relationships with people.
Um, you know, I've I, I do a lot of, or used to, not as much anymore. Used to do a lot of public speaking, both before ALS and after. I love it, and I think, I didn't think about this early on when you asked me about talent. That probably is my major talent. Is I love it. I'm a I'm more comfortable on a podium in front of hundreds of people than I am one on one, and I enjoy it tremendously. Uh, and so, but in the course of some of my speeches, I've I hit on the theme of um, that I actually find. I think I've found, you know, the I'm not going to say, meaning of life, you know, but the worth of my life. Um, and I found that over the last 7 years, what I've been able to do, the work that we collectively do, in advocacy or raising awareness, whatever, that has been much more worthwhile than anything I did in 35 years in the corporate world. And it's a nice feeling.
Very well said. I often say that this journey strips all of the unimportant things away and leaves us only with those things that are most important, not just to ourselves, but in general. We learn what is important, time with the people that we care about, things that we leave behind, things that we help other people with, um, making the world a little better. Um, those are the things that I'm focused on as well right now. And I could not have imagined being here before this journey. I could not have imagined this for myself. But that is something that ALS has given to me.
And I would never say that I'm glad I had ALS, but I will say that I'm glad for the things I've learned and the people I've encountered, the experiences I've had because I had ALS. Um, and it's a huge difference between those two sentiments, right? Um, so,
I
yeah.
asked another artist the other day what he's learned from ALS, and he said, ALS sucks.
Yes,
It's the first thing
Absolutely.
that we've learned.
But
Abs-
it does suck, but you're right. I mean, look at what it's given us. I mean, the people that I know in the ALS world, I mean, I look back at my 30s and the people that I know now don't even compare. The people that I knew then don't compare to the richness of the people that I know now. And like Ellen, I couldn't imagine myself being in this position. I couldn't imagine that I'd be going through life without my sister, but it's just this world, this community it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. And the strength that you have, Troy, oh, you and all the others living with this disease, the strength, the stamina that you have.
I appreciate that. I'll let you in on a little secret. I don't know. I know myself. I don't know across the ALS community, but um, I always get very, I don't know, when people say, you know, you're an inspiration and whatever, I get very uneasy with that. Um, because for me, I'm just do what I need to do. I don't consider it necessarily particularly inspiring. Um, it's just what you do. I don't know. I mean, to me, it's very straightforward, and um, you know, there's nothing extraordinary, about it. Um, but that's, I guess, because I'm knee deep in it, right? It's your own life, and so you lose some of that perspective.
Exactly. And to
But
others who are not living with a terminal disease and doing all of the things that you do, that others in the community do, it is totally,
but
totally.
but it's the tricky part, Carolyn, because I look at what other people do, and I look at it as extraordinary. I don't necessarily look at myself in that light, but I certainly, every time there's a Tim Lowry panel, every time there's a Ledge team meeting, every time there's a, whatever, um, and I look around and I say, gosh, these are really, truly extraordinary people. I got to work harder to meet that standard. Um, like, the slacker, uh, kind of thing. But, we're, we all look at ourselves in a totally different lens than we look at other people. But, um, but I do tell my healthy friends, you know, healthy in it's a relative term, I suspect, but, you know, folks not dealing with, a major illness, that if you ever feel down, if you're ever sort of questioning things, find yourself a person who's living with ALS, because I wholeheartedly believe that there's nothing more inspiring and more uplifting than what I have seen out of this community. And um, don't feel sorry and don't feel pity. Just simply look at how they approach life, and that's all you need to change
If you can have
your
just a little
perspective.
piece of that, just a
Yeah,
little piece of that,
yeah,
you can completely change your life.
absolutely.
Mhm.
It's for me as a person living with it, it has been my greatest source of inspiration, has been my fellow people living with ALS.
Mhm.
And you meet them and you never want to give up. You never want to let up. I mean,
Have to keep pushing.
it's that simple.
Mhm. Couldn't agree more.
I made Carolyn cry. I'm sorry.
We don't apologize for tears around here.
No. Mm-mm.
A good majority of my interviews are filled with tears, and that is just how it works.
Thank you.
That is just how it works. So, is there something that you might have asked me if you were designing this interview as a question that maybe you would have asked that I didn't ask you?
I think the only thing I can think of is in terms of, and it's a tricky one, but in terms of, a legacy that that you leave behind, or a way that you would want to be remembered. And I know it's tricky because it will make you reflect on a time that you might no longer be here. And when there's an email floating around with that subject line, open only if you're in a good place.
Mhm.
And I hate those emails.
Mhm.
Um, but it's part of it, right?
It
Um,
is.
but I just wonder, the folks that participate in this gallery, or even folks that dive headfirst into advocacy or raising awareness, or in whichever way, organized Lou Gehrig Day games, and whatever it is that they get involved in. And you wonder that do they do this because they want to leave something behind, because they want to be remembered, you know, beyond the time that they're here. That might be the only thing, I guess, that if I was doing the interview, I would ask. But like I said, it gets tricky.
I think
Right.
that's a question that we all ask of ourselves, though. Um, or even if it's not a question, I think it's just a desire for people to be known for who they are. I think that's one of our deepest desires, is to be known for who we are and to be loved for who we are, and really to be understood. And I think the thing that this gallery does is that brings that forward. You talked about the vulnerability of bringing your art forward and talking about it and having people look at it and examine it. And part of that is opening yourself up to being known. I've lost a lot of people in my life, and I don't even know if I can recreate this saying, but there's an old Texas saying that, people bring joy. Some when they come into a room and some when they leave. And I've always wondered which one I am. Am I the person that brings joy when I come into the room, or am I the person who brings joy into the room when I leave? But I think that's a question that even outside the ALS community, that people ask themselves, what am
I
I
ask
to
I
people?
ask myself all the time,
Mm.
you
Yeah.
know, and specific to the gallery and the art. Um, you know, Certainly it serves as, I don't call it therapy, but you know, it's certainly helpful, you know, around, but maybe it's also a tangible something tangible that will outlive us.
Mhm.
You know, we're living America record. And so, you know,
Gallery
those,
is certainly that, but I just have to say that these interviews, this communion that we have on these interviews, to me is much more so um, of a legacy that I want to leave behind. People aren't just going to look at your pictures. They're going to look at your interview and they're going to get to know you through this interview.
Mhm,
you know,
mhm, mhm.
we've all at some point in time have either carved in a tree or written in a wall, you know, I was here, kind of thing. And maybe this project is in a way the I was here. Um,
I'm still here.
I'm
Yeah.
still here.
I'm
That's
still
right.
here.